Now, what happened was in 1905, so 2 years after the Women's Social and Political Union was formed, there was a demonstration for the rights of the unemployed in Manchester, where this new group had been founded. And at the end of the demonstration, instead of everybody just going home, a few men went and blocked a road, and they got arrested, and they got taken to court. And so, surprise, surprise, suddenly the media was interested. And they got their names in the newspapers. Everybody was suddenly talking about this campaign. Now, this really inspired these early suffragettes in the Women's Social and Political Union as a way of putting what was quite a small organisation on the map and getting noticed. And how much more would they be noticed because they were women going to use these new tactics of direct action and civil disobedience. Now, what happened was 1905 was just before the big 1906 general election. So, obviously, imagine, it's not difficult to imagine the kind of lead up to a general election, the kind of campaigning that's done, candidates going out and speaking to the public. That's exactly what happened in Manchester. And two women went along to ask whether the Liberal Party, this was a Liberal Party meeting, they went along to ask if the Liberals got into government, which it looked like they would, and indeed they did, would they give votes for women? And the two women who went along were Sylvia's older sister, Sylvia Pankhurst, and one of these women who were involved in the cotton mills, in the trade unions there, a young woman called Annie Kenny. And they went along to this meeting, and they put up their hand and they asked their question. And in those days, if politicians didn't, find the question a bit awkward, they'd just ignore it, particularly if it was asked by a woman. So they just, it's unbelievable, imagine that. So this is exactly what happened in the meeting, but, and a good tip really, these women refused to stop asking their questions. They carried on, and lots of the men around them thought this was awfully bad form, and told them to shut up. So they got up on their chairs and they shouted the question, and then they unfurled a big Votes for Women banner, and eventually they were ejected from the meeting and arrested and taken to court. But instead of agreeing to pay a fine for what they'd done, which was basically asking for their question to be answered, instead of agreeing to pay a fine, they chose to go to prison. Now, this was absolutely scandalous. If you think about, this was women going to do this, particularly Sylvia Pankhurst, who was from a middle-class, very well-known family. And this made headlines all around the world. And this was really the start of what we know as the militant suffragette movement. And it's worth remembering when we think about the later militancy that women employed. Militancy started with women asking for their question to be answered. You could be arrested, basically, for doing that. The Liberal Party, it has to be said, then changed their tactics after that. Instead of actually answering some questions, they later decided this was too much of a disruption and they would ban all women from their public meetings. That didn't work because the suffragettes were quite inventive, creative and quite humorous people really. And you might know that around the next general election that was held while the militant suffragette movement was going on, the election in January 1910, David Lloyd George, who was a particular target of the suffragettes, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer and he hated the suffragette movement. He went to do a meeting in Louth, and again women were banned from this meeting, and so to get round the ban, two suffragettes arrived the night before, got into the ceiling with some chocolate, boiled eggs and some German black bread, waited all day for the meeting to start and then created a massive commotion in the ceiling. Apparently Lloyd George had to sit down and be quiet while they got ejected, and they came out obviously covered in dust because it was just, it was horrible on the ceiling, and they threw a flag down at him while he was talking, and then a stone came through the window. So they still managed to be very, very disruptive, even though the Liberals did all they could to kind of stop them. But as well as deploying militancy, the militant suffragette movement also used lots of collective action. And in particular, they were challenged by the Liberal government who at one point said to the women, well, we would give you the vote. The only problem is nobody else really agrees with your cause. So if you can't prove that your cause is popular, you know, how on earth can we agree to give you the vote? Because no one really wants this except for you lot. So the suffragettes took this as a challenge, and they organised what was, up to that point, the biggest demonstration in British political history. They filled Hyde Park, and after this, they said, well, look, not only have we proved we've got mass support, we've proved we can mobilise more people than any other campaign in support of votes for women. And the government turned around and said they still weren't granting votes for women. Now, this provides a dilemma for the suffragette movement and provides a bit of a turning point in terms of its politics, in terms of the tactics that it uses. Now, one response was to turn to more militancy. It's after this that the first stones are thrown through the windows of number 10 Downing Street, partly in anger at the way they'd been treated by the government, partly because the demonstration they held outside Parliament was greeted with quite a lot of violence, including sexual violence from the police. And the women to protest about this went and threw stones through the windows of number 10, really saying, you know, how else can we make our point heard? So on the one hand, there was a turn towards more militancy, but on the other hand, there was a turn away from that kind of collective action, away from those sort of big demonstrations that they'd organised before, and a turn towards using what they called more influential women, by which they meant richer women. And there was a problem in the suffragette movement in that the press, surprise, surprise, were much more interested if somebody rich and famous was sent to prison than if it was somebody who worked in a factory. And some of the suffragettes, led by Sylvia Pankhurst, Sylvia's older sister, argued that really working class women, that rich women could campaign on their behalf. That working class women had too much to do anyway in their lives. They were, you know, too overworked. They, you know, had to look after their children. They, you know, had long hours, low pay. Probably couldn't afford to come on all of the demonstrations. So her solution was to turn towards having these more influential women involved to campaign on, as they would put it, their poorer sisters' behalf. And really, there sort of came this argument in the movement that working class women were far too weak to really fight effectively for their own rights. Now, this obviously starts to change the politics of the campaign when you've got richer women involved. And the suffragettes were told now to leave behind any class feeling, and that's how it was put, which meant that the sole issue had to be the issue of the vote. So all those reasons that women had got involved in the first place, the women who'd been involved in the factories, who wanted better conditions at work, those people who'd been involved in the unemployment campaign, who wanted a better deal for unemployed people, they were told to leave those issues aside. It was now going to be just a focus on the vote. Now, Sylvia Pankhurst, the suffragette that I wrote about, was a socialist, and she didn't like the way this was turning. And she fundamentally disagreed with it. And then something happened in 1910, which gave her a very different perspective about how the campaign could be organised. Because in 1910, there started what's known now as the Great Unrest. And this was really a wave of what would be called now wildcat strikes. These were workers who were often seen as at the bottom of the pile, often workers without even a trade union, doing some of the most menial, miserable jobs in Britain. People who'd previously been dismissed, even by the workers, as unorganisable. These workers suddenly went out on strike. And this lasted for 4 years, lasted up to the outbreak of the First World War. Workers in industry after industry came out on strike, had big demonstrations, and really brought the country to a standstill. And crucially, amongst these workers who'd been dismissed as incapable of fighting for their rights was a sizable number of women workers, particularly women who worked in things like the packing factories or jam factories, and you know, packing biscuits and tea and this sort of thing. And these were some of the most horrendous jobs, really, that you could have. If you think about the jam factories, these would be women who worked obviously incredibly long hours, but, you know, running around, they were obviously, you know, worked very, very hard. They would have to run around with boiling vats of jam on slippery floors, because there would also be people washing the pots in which to put the jam. So there were incredible, horrendous industrial accidents and deaths at work in these kind of workplaces. These were the kinds of women who came out on strike. And really what Sylvia Pankhurst saw was that far from being the weakest people in society, it was women like these, when they stood together, could actually be some of the strongest women in society. In fact, they had a unique strength that some of the other richer women didn't have, which is that they could unite together and stop things from happening. Now, Sylvia Pankhurst thought this was very, very important for a couple of reasons. One was she thought the suffragette movement badly needed new allies. Now, if we think about the way that the suffragette movement developed, obviously militancy got more and more extreme, prison sentences got longer and longer, women were, from 1909, going on hunger strike in the prisons, and the hunger strike was something that women engaged in to demand political prisoner status in prison. There were different categories of prisoner, and as a political prisoner, you didn't have to do things like hard labour in prison, for example. Now, very, very often, suffragette prisoners were not treated as political. So all the things that they did when they smashed windows, that was treated as like, just as if a vandal had done it, or somebody who'd done it for no reason at all, rather than because they were campaigning for a political cause. So very often they were sent to prison in really the nastiest and most unpleasant conditions, and they were made to do hard labour. So in protest at that, they went on hunger strike. The government's response was not to grant them political prisoner status. The government's response was to force feed those women, which, you know, I'm sure people know about, and possibly over cake is not the time to go into a graphic description of how horrible that was, but really that was torture. That's what was happening in the prisons. Now, this raises the stake for the suffragette movement very, very considerably, and you know, women turn to more extreme tactics. They turn to arson and things like that, which, because the British criminal system places such a high value on property, is one of the sentences that is the longest if you commit arson. So women were going to prison now for very long periods of time indeed, and suffering very, very considerably when they were in prison. So Sylvia thought this was a movement that needed as many allies as it could possibly get. And she also thought that these women working in the factories were the natural allies of the suffragette movement. Because, after all, it was for a better world that the suffragettes were fighting. A better world for all women, Sylvia Pankhurst thought. But also she thought that these women were really facing the same enemy. It was the same government that was cracking down on people that went on strike in this period, and they sent the troops against people that went on strike. It was the same government sending out troops against people who were striking just for better conditions. That was the same government that was torturing women in prison or sending out the police to attack the demonstrations. So she thought these groups of people had a lot in common and that they should work together. Now really, when all this comes to a head is 1913, which was really a big moment of dilemma for this workers' movement, because in Dublin, the employers got together and decided to lock out of work anybody that dared to be a member